Hello, good evening, and welcome to the 1912 Exiles podcast, the original, the biggest, the best Newport County podcast made by the fans, for the fans, powered by the Terrace Podcast Network. And this is the part where I usually say brought to you in association with the Riverside Sports Bar. But tonight, not only are we brought to you by the Riverside Sports Bar, we're actually in the Riverside Sports Bar, the award-nominated Riverside Sports Bar I saw earlier today. They've been nominated for a Community Sport Pub award in Wales, so well done to them. I'm joined by friend of the pod, fifth Beatle of the podcast, Ollie. How you doing, Ollie?
Yeah, not too bad. A lot better after the past few results, I feel.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So we are recording on Tuesday night, just before the Trust meeting, and we're going to chat about that later on in the pod. And we're also going to talk about the Bradford game on Saturday. But first, I've got three quick bits of business to do. Number one, we have been really bad at asking you to leave us reviews wherever you get your podcasts. For reasons I don't fully understand, it really helps with the algorithm to attract more listeners. So if you like what we do, then leave a 5-star review at your podcatcher of choice. And from now on, if people say nice things about us, we will give you a shout out on the pod. So big thanks to Nick the Togger and to Von, who both left nice comments in recent months. Second thing is to thank all of our regular Ko-Fi supporters who keep the pod going. So that's Ben, Anthony, Josh, Mark, Hamid, Hoyligan, Surrey Exile, Lyndon, Blairinho, Daniel, Alan, Dr. Bad Vibe, Girl Saturday, Billy Punk and Taff. And it gladdens my heart that list gets longer and longer every time we do it. So thank you for helping to keep the lights on at Pod HQ. And then the final bit of business, a quick word for our two featured local sides this season. I had the pleasure of watching Undie Women last Sunday in a thoroughly entertaining cup game against Cymru Celtic's development side. How Undie lost, I will never know, but it finished 4-2. And one of the Cymru goals was out of this world, an absolute screamer from 25 yards. And bless them, Undie let us choose the player of the game, so well done Cat Thompson, who must have covered every blade of grass. Meanwhile, Chepstow Town's men's team are sitting second in the Ardell South East, a bit off Trio at the top of the table, but with games in hand over the sides below them. Mark Ingalls has clearly got them playing some good stuff, and we hope to get down there again soon. But that's enough introduction. Ollie, we've got to talk about that 0-0 against Bradford City on Saturday. Real talk, we probably would all have taken a 0-0 draw at 5-3 on Saturday, but after that early sending off, should County have been more ambitious?
It's half and half, and just before we started recording, we were talking about how polarising this result has been. I was firmly in the camp that I was happy with a point and that we could nick all 3 points in the right circumstances. Could we have got 3 points? Probably could, but the way Bradford had set up after the sending off, and I think the way that we approached the game from a position that we probably haven't prepared for, it's just a mix of sort of a conflict of styles. I'm happy with the point. I'm glad we're keeping the momentum. Am I a little bit angry we didn't get the 3 points? Yes, but you know, you've got to sort of look at it as 1 point gained, keeping the momentum going, and how embarrassing it would have been to have lost in that game.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. Bradford will certainly have looked at our form going into that game and their away record, and they'll have set up to try and not take too many risks and maybe nick it, add in the red card, and there's no way they were going to push for a win unless it was gift wrapped. For our part, I thought, you know, we knew we'd be up against one of the best defences in the league, so all of our preparation, like you say, would have been to not concede and maybe try and nick one on the break or via a set piece. And the red card helped us in the sense of the man advantage, but I think, like you say, it made Bradford harder to break down and even less susceptible to the counter-attack. So we were basically left being reliant on set pieces, which, if I had one criticism, I mean, they were absolute garbage on Saturday. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it's gone back to that set-piece roulette where whether the set-piece was going to make it past the first man. If that game was 11 versus 11, we probably would have caught them out, but credit where credit is due. They sat back, They let us have the ball. They sort of weathered us as much as they could and limited our chances, which were just poor in quality. And I think both teams probably deserved the point for the efforts they put into the match.
And on the red card, because Bradford fans, everyone would have seen in their timelines on social media, were enraged about the red card being given. What did you think of it?
I think for me it was a red card because it's an obvious goal scoring opportunity. Some people were saying that it wasn't going to be an obvious goal scoring opportunity, but then you get into semantics of what's obvious and what's a potential goal scoring opportunity.
It felt as though it all hinged on whether you thought the other defender would have got back or not, and I'm not convinced from where I was sat that he would have done.
It's also hinged on the fact of whether Courtney Baker-Richardson could put it in the net. I think,
well, yeah.
On his form this season, I think it could be a little bit dubious there, but I'm never going to complain about a decision going our way. I think there was a chance right at the end where Orvie Boney was through on goal towards the North Terrace and he got pulled back a little bit, and I think that was more of a goal scoring opportunity than what CBR had, and we got nothing for that. So, swings and roundabouts, you get them, you don't get others.
The other question that I wanted to ask you, because there's been a lot of talk about the lack of entertainment value on Saturday, which I think probably we all felt in the stands. Where are you on that? I mean, do you worry about the lack of entertainment value at the moment, or are ugly points the priority?
I think it's a very, very fine balance. I mean, we can play ugly football and we can win the league. We can play pretty football and be playing at Maidenhead away next season. So I think we've got to balance it a little bit. What I'm interested in seeing is we've reverted to this 3-5-2 formation, sort of needs must, points at any measures necessary, and we sort of strayed away from the 4-2-3-1 pretty football that Jenkins wants to implement. Now that we're relatively safe, I don't want to say absolutely mathematically 100% nailed on League 2 next season, but the closer we get to safety and pulling away from the stragglers round the bottom, are we going to revert back to the pretty football and sort of ease ourselves in for next season, which some might argue this is what we should have done all along? Start with the 5-3-2, be a bit more disciplined, a bit more regimented, and then when everything's a bit more secure and we've got that 2-month window at the end of the season to then start playing a bit more fluid and fancy. It's really up in the air to see how the club moves forward, not just this season but next season as well.
Yeah, and I guess that's it now. We are probably at the point of looking and thinking, what are the priorities between now and the end of the season? And I was thinking through this, and I think there's three. The first thing is beat last season's points haul so that everyone inside the club and outside the club, including potential signings, can see the progress that's been made. Then it's about settling on the right shape and the right approach for the team going forwards, which I think we're starting to do. And then it's about identifying the best 11 for the system out of the players we've got, and also identifying the gaps, I suppose, for the summer. And I think if we do all of those three things, we finish the season with momentum and a clear plan for next year. We're still some way off the finished product, but we've now got the space to breathe, to blood some of those younger players, newer players, and to think about another season in the 4th Division. I also think we're probably at the point where we should only be playing other clubs' low knees if we think they'll be here next year, and if they're not, then let's give game time instead to the players we've got under contract for next season so they can hit the ground running in August. How does that map onto your priorities?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think we've got a bigger squad than we have had in previous seasons. I think there's lots of contracted players who have been a little bit hard done by to not get opportunities. I'm looking at the likes of Michael Spellman, the likes of Orvie Boney.
Jeffrey or Orvie?
Well, both really. It could be either.
Jeffrey's the older one, Orvie's the younger one, right?
And then Wilfred somewhere in the middle, I think. But yeah, I think they're totally spot on. I think of all the loanies we have, I'd be surprised if any of them are here next season. I think a few of the transfers we brought in have been a little bit weird. I'm looking at the likes of Lewis Webb and Jaden Warner, who have both come in January on 18-month contract. They've not seen a sniff of the pitch at the moment, and I'm wondering what it's going to take for them to get on the pitch, whether now that we're more concrete in our suits of League 2 next season, whether they start to get phased in. whether the likes of, if Kieran Evans is fit, is he coming back in? Which players are going to be playing for their contracts, which players are going to be put in the shop window to be sold on to bring in revenue for next season. There's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, I mean, Warner's an interesting one. I'm sure probably he was brought in with the expectation he would be playing football fairly soon, but you're not going to mess up this defence at the moment, so I can understand why they're maybe a little bit reluctant, but I'm sure he will get a chance. Well, look, thank you, Ollie. We will take a quick break now and have a word from our sponsors, and then we will pick the conversation up in a few hours' time after the trust meeting. Right, well, it's 25 to 9. The meeting has just finished. People are sort of filtering out of the hospitality area at Rodney Parade. Let's go through it then, Ollie, and talk about that meeting. So, in terms of raw numbers, there were, 50 or 60 in the room? I couldn't quite tell. 70 odd joining online. And the thing that surprised me was that there are only about a dozen or so questions submitted in advance. So the panel at the front was Amber Arney as chair of the trust, Huw Jenkins as chair of Newport County, and Mike Everett as secretary, is he, to the trust? Yes, so, there we go. We won't go through every single one of the questions and answers because I think the trust will put the recording up and people can watch it back at their leisure. But perhaps if we just really quickly look down the list and go, which of these aren't the questions and answers do we think was fascinating? So I'll group together a couple. So the first question that I think came from online was from Daniel about what plans are there to keep the experienced players, Shane McLaughlin, Nick Townsend and James Clark. And Huw said, looking to next year, it's got to be right financially. It has to be on our own terms as a club as to whether we keep those players, which I thought was a bit vague, but, perfectly understandable. And that linked to one that we had later on where Logan in the room asked, are we looking to keep any of the loan players? And again, Huw was perhaps understandably quite non-committal. I mean, you wouldn't expect him to necessarily announce Clarkey signed a new contract or we're going to go all out to keep Carl Hudlin next season. But were you surprised by any of those answers?
It's obvious at this point that Huw is looking for a younger squad, and it was touched on a little bit in an answer he gave me about financial stability, where obviously you bring in these younger players with the view to potentially sell them on. I think for longevity purposes, you're going to want a younger squad and, top up the core where you can. I think another point that was made that really interested me is to do with players travelling to and from their family homes. Obviously, we're in a position where we can't pay sums to players for them to relocate partners and children to the area. So there are situations where they will travel on their days off or they will leave the match, leave an away match and go straight back to their home. So I think going forward, looking at the sort of transfer policy and the type of players we're bringing in, it's definitely going to be younger. We're going to be preferring local. And I think Jenkins was really sort of setting his ways of whatever benefits the club is what we're going to do.
Yeah, I mean, the question you alluded to, so that was from Colin Everett, who talked about Kai Whitmore as being kind of one of the breakthrough stars of the season, and are there more plans to bring through players from the Cymru leagues? And yeah, Mr. Jenkins said Kai's done well in his first year, but it takes time to acclimatise to full-time football. And then he made that point that you said about the extra kind of commitment and atmosphere you get amongst a squad when you've got locally based players, who are getting the bus all the way back to Newport after all those long away games in Carlisle and Doncaster and Harrogate, and living close to each other, and lots of nods around the place. And I think that's something that probably we all understand. But so I think that was an encouraging one. Looking through some of the other questions, so Jonathan Pask asked a couple of good questions in the room, but this one kind of cut to the chase. Before the bad run, were you worried about results and retaining our league status? And at that point, what was more important, retaining league status or sticking to the kind of financial plan? I hope I've expressed that right. And Huw, he sort of hedged his bets really. He said footballing success is the priority, but the financial side has to be sustainable. And that kind of ran through a few answers really. He talked about investment and said, we'd of course like investment, but that invites questions about shares and diluting existing shareholding. And the priority is making the club as it is sustainable financially first. And again, that sort of stuff we're quite used to hearing from him. But I thought it was fascinating to hear that point about balancing out the risks, I suppose, on retaining the league status. also on investment. Mark, I think this was online, asked, would Huw consider investment from John Pratt if the offer was there? And yeah, Huw made that point that, he'd like investment, but it has to be the right person with the right offer. Quote, it can't be money for money's sake. Too many people on the board may not be right for the club long term. And he was clear he didn't mean that as a reflection on John Pratt personally, but just as a kind of general principle. Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in a bit of an awkward situation with both Jenkins and the trust not looking to dilute their shareholding anymore. I know lots has been made about whatever percentage it is single shareholders, but I think you've got to consider the time and finances going into recouping all that. So it's going to be interesting to see how the investment is brought in, when it's brought in. Jenkins was very clear about right time, right person. So I've got no worries about us needing investment immediately. And if we do bring someone in, I think it's going to be because they've got good interest in the right sort of morals for the club.
Yeah, and I mean, you asked a question about financial sustainability and the link to the kind of player model and, selling players. Is that critical? And you basically said, well, yes, if you want to have investment, then that's where it's going to come from. It will be from selling players so we can boost the playing budget and we can invest in infrastructure. And he said a lot of money has already gone into keeping things ticking over. He wants to reduce the money he's having to put in, and player sales is one way to do it, but not at the expense of squad strength. Moving on then, there were some questions about infrastructure. So Carl, I think it was online, asked about progress being made towards a permanent training base. Huw said they're still looking for a plot of land that the club can buy, likely somewhere already used for sport. So, a rugby or football pitch. 2 pitches would be ideal. Even 1.5 pitches was mentioned. I'm not quite sure what you do with half a pitch. I guess it would mean you could work on defence, but not attack, or vice versa. But he was very clear, it's something we would want to have on our own, not shared with anyone else or co-owned. And he gave the figure that we're spending $200K a season at the moment renting other people's facilities, which is a big old chunk of change. And on a sort of similar note, I put in a question about the Cabbage Patch next to Rodney Parade, which it was in the Dragons Lair podcast that at their Q&A with their chairman, the Dragons have spent, a 6-figure sum, according to their chairman anyway, on doing feasibility studies for what could happen with that plot of land, and they've been having discussions with partners, including the council. And my question was whether we were one of those partners, and if so, what our view was. And I was quite surprised because Hugh's response was, I haven't had much feedback. Jonathan Wilshire, I think, indicated that there hadn't been any contact. I was surprised by that, because I would just have assumed that we would have been part of that discussion, but it sounds as though perhaps our relationship with the Dragons isn't as warm as it used to be. Was that your reading, or am I reading too much into it?
No, there were a few questions where the relationship with the Dragons was brought up, obviously in regards to the lease, but also investment and the sort of day-to-day running. And it does certainly feel like in some elements the relationship has improved, and in some elements it might have fractured a little bit, and it still feels a little bit frosty to me. Ultimately, the Dragons hold the power. We might hold something in terms of financial income for them. But yeah, I think it's sort of picking and choosing our battles here.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's one of the big learning points from tonight, is that we aren't perhaps as plugged into that discussion as we might be, and that may be fine. But from me looking from the outside in, that seemed an odd one. So yeah, then we had a bit of a comfort break, and then when we came back, there was a question about where will County be in 10 years' time, which, Huw tried to look at his crystal ball and again spoke very sensibly, I thought. The challenge is to better our points tally every season and hope that brings success. And he said, quote, I'd be disappointed if we didn't push for promotion to League One. I wouldn't have got involved otherwise, which I thought was, exactly what you want to hear. But it wasn't, saying I want Champions League football in 10 years. It was, over the course of the next decade, let's build things sustainably and aim for promotion and make that sustainable. We then had an excellent question from Harps about how we ensure our academy graduates have a future here. And I'm slightly missed, I think, the point he was making at the start of his answer about the club's academies, Category 3 status, and the amount of money it was costing. 200 grand was mentioned, but I wasn't clear at the timescale of that. But clearly, a lot of money has been sunk into the academy for relatively little in terms of progress. And so he said the aim is for us to keep 5 or 6 this year from the under-18s, even though they're clearly not yet ready for first team football. and we then have to find them the right home so they can develop in senior football and come back and stake a claim for a place here. And then he said, quote, a lot of the academy system across league clubs doesn't work because they're not playing men's football. And, then for me, the fascinating point was county like Cardiff and Swansea and Wrexham are at a disadvantage because we can only move players to non-league clubs in England during the transfer window, whereas English-based clubs in the Football League can loan them to non-league clubs at any time they want. So, we are restricted. We can move them in the transfer window, or we can loan clubs to the Cymru League sides, but we don't have quite the same freedom. And that was something I sort of inherently knew, but actually to hear it stated, you go, yeah, that does feel like a bit of a disadvantage.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a shock, and I think it's a nice luxury to have, to be able to call players back in a situation where squad injuries are rife, and we've got that little bit of contingency. But I think it just means that we've got to be a little bit more careful with the squad planning, and I think it informed a lot more of the discussion going into transfer windows now.
Yeah, and injuries was another point that came up. So Chris Thomas in the room asked timelines for injured players coming back. So Hudlin will be out for 5 or 6 weeks. Wildig won't be back this season. Kieran Evans and Whitmore might be back in a week or so. And then I popped up again and asked about injuries and whether injuries in general are a worry. It feels to me, I think it feels like to a lot of us as though County have quite a bad record in recent years of players being out for a long time. But I thought it was interesting, Mr. Jenkins said, it wasn't as worrying, the situation we find ourselves in this season, as last season. It sounded as though the number and the extent of those injuries that we've had is within the normal or expected range. But he made the point that training facilities are a contributing factor too, and only when we have a stable base will we really know for sure just sort of how bad our injury problems are, because when you've got players training on different surfaces on different days of the week, you're sort of inviting problems. So I think that sort of further added to the problems that we've got. The final couple of questions were about the relationship between Mr. Jenkins as chairman and Nelson Jardim as manager, how they met and how they built that relationship. But then you asked a very specific question about how long is Nelson's contract? Is he here for the long term? To which the answer was he signed a 1-year contract, so that's going to expire over the summer. And Mr. Jenkins said, again, quote, between now and the end of the season, we'll talk and see how things go. And he talked about, quote unquote, doing what's best for the club, which wasn't quite as fulsome as I might have expected.
Yeah, I appreciate he doesn't really want to sit either way on the fence and sort of commits to Jardim being here next year, and he wants to go back home to the family. But at the same time, it didn't feel like a lot of confidence. This is Jenkins' man going forward, and when you view the way he's spoke about the clubs that's take over, it's not just a season by season thing. This is a project, and I think for that you'd want an established figurehead, no matter how experienced he is, to say, this is the man who's going to take us forward. It does feel like the issues that we had in the summer now sort of being kicked down the roads to next season, and if we don't manage to tie Nelson down, if it's not something he's willing to do, are we still going to be Nelson Jardim Dambrami come June, July, August?
Yeah, I mean, that was, like I say, I may be reading too much into it, but it wasn't as full-throated a backing of the coaches maybe we might have expected, given how well Fight Back February has gone. And that more or less was it. There was a good question from Andy at the end about the trust's income and whether that drops during the bad run that we had when people were getting disillusioned. Arnie said, the bigger drop off was after the Man United game. Yeah, Mike Everett said, if we have a bad time on the pitch, cancelling direct debits and subs to the trust damages the club even more. And they, quite rightly finished by plugging the trust, and every pound that goes into it helps the club. So, we'll put a link in the show notes to that. And then there was a commitment that there will be one more of these before the season is out. So that was the kind of whistle-stop tour of the discussion. I mean, do watch it back if you weren't there tonight or you didn't watch online. But I mean, I'm going to put you on the spot then, Ollie. What were your sort of 2 or 3 takeaways from that?
I think it's really interesting to sort of get more information on the financial side, as we've alluded to. I think it was 200k a year that is going into the academy, 200k a season going into rental costs for training facilities, 50 to 60 grand a month on pitch repairs, which is a 50-50 split on how the pitch is sorted. And so I think the financial side and the stability we still got some ways to go, but Jenkins has alluded to the fact that there's positive elements in that. I was actually quite shocked with how open and honest he was about player injuries, and when they're coming back, there's sort of there's no Graham Coughlin-esque tactics of, oh, he might be back on this week, he might be back this week, he might be back in March.
Yeah.
I think overall the honestness and the openness from all three board members to answer questions, there was no real in our whilst you tried to formulate some answers. They all seem well informed. They all seem like they've got their heads and their hearts in the right place, and I think I'm definitely a lot more confident about the future in the club. Not that I had many doubts beforehand, but to sort of know that things are right and everything's going to plan.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. There was no sense of certain things were off the table for discussion. It was very open and honest, straight questions and straight answers. Clearly Mr. Jenkins is a lot more involved, I would say, in player issues than any other chairman I can remember in the time that I've been watching football here or anywhere else. He had very strong views on, Shane McLaughlin's best position is in midfield and, all the rest of it that I wouldn't necessarily have expected a chairman to express, but that's his model, and he's very clear about financial sustainability is the target, and the laser-like focus on that I think is a encouraging one, and the thing we probably need to hear. I think the things that I would go away with a question about is that relationship with the Dragons and whether that maybe needs to be strengthened in the longer term. And yeah, the Nelson Jardim and will he still be head coach next season? I'm not sure. I feel quite as confident on that as perhaps I did at 7:00. But no, I think well done to the trust in the club for organising it. Well done to those who came along and asked questions, and well done to the panel for giving good, clear answers. And I'll look forward to coming back and doing it again in a few months' time. And that's more or less it for now, listeners. We'll be having a short break before the next episode, so there won't be anything out at the weekend post-Cheltenham. Instead, we're going to do a wrap-up of Cheltenham and Doncaster together, potentially with a full panel doing a deeper dive. But until then, thank you, Ollie.
Thank you.
Look after yourselves, look after each other. Do good in the world and may it do you the world of good. And above all, as always, keep it counting.